This week on the right side, the Wildrose and PC Party of Alberta agree to form the United Conservative Party. Andrew Weaver in BC reveals his demands. Trudeau begins shifting away power from the West with the NEB, and time spent this summer on unnecessary apologies. This is The Right Side, Episode 17, recorded Saturday, May 20th, 2017. Unnecessary Apologies. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Right Side. You guys are listening to episode 17 of The Right Side right now. Shane and Patrick are here, as we are every week. Welcome back.
It's good to be back, as always. The weather's getting nicer, and hopefully our stories are getting nicer, too.
Oh, they are this week. This week we have a series of great news coming out from, well, at least Alberta and maybe Canada, depending on the way you look at things. But before we get too far down the track, of course, Right Side is a podcast that aims to cut out the sensationalism and bias that you find in the mainstream media and that you watch on the news every night, and you're scratching your head if you're wondering what all those people with all that makeup on their faces are really believing what they're saying, or if it's just the producers of the newscast setting the agenda and inserting the bias and sensationalism. And that's why we're here. We don't have makeup, we don't have cameras, and we don't have bias and sensationalism.
I don't think we'd look much better if we had makeup on anyways, so it's better to just give it to you guys straight, like we always do.
That's right. Well, there is always the possibility of the video Right Side in the future, but that would be putting the camel before the horse.
Yes. And speaking of putting the camel before the horse, I believe that segues nicely into our first story, which is...
Indeed it does.
Coming from Alberta.
Yes, this story is something that we talked about previously very early on in the Right Side, and it's something that a lot of people didn't think would be possible, but a great step forward has been made in Alberta to bring the PCs and the Wildrose together. This week on May 18th, it was announced that the Wildrose Party and the Progressive Conservative Party have reached a tentative unity agreement. This unity agreement was signed in Edmonton by both leaders of the parties, Brian Jean for the Wildrose and Jason Kenney for the PCs. The agreement sets forward the process for the creation of the United Conservative Party. The agreement must be ratified by 50% of the PCs and 75% of the Wildrose. This will happen in a referendum between the two parties on July 22nd. That's a very quick timetable from, considering Jason Kenney was just elected PC leader back in March, and the whole PC leadership campaign and his Unite Alberta campaign actually just began last summer. So that is impressive progress and very quick.
Yeah, and considering that even until recently, in the past year or so, Brian Jean didn't seem to really want to unite the two parties together. The fact that they've been able to work something out and do something that's probably good for all Albertans is quite impressive. And,
it all comes from experience, and it goes back to the original 2003 agreement between the federal Progressive Conservatives and the Canadian Alliance. There's a lot of commonality between these two mergers, so it was kind of a worn track for both, but of course it's different because it's in Alberta. But anyways, following this, constituency associations will be established across the province, and a new leader for this United Conservative Party will be selected on October 28th. So, of course, this means the goal is to have a leader in place for the UCP by, I'm guessing, what would be the start of the fall session of the legislature here. Which, I mean, if considering what a seismic shift that would be, to have the government facing a united opposition party, that could really get some work done. Also, regardless of what's being talked about in the mainstream media, it needs to be understated and really underscored that the United Conservative Party will not be a party of the far right, and the NDP has already begun this narrative, and the mainstream media has continued on happily as they received the word from the NDP that this is going to be a collection of far right parties, and to quote Rachel Notley, If they went any farther right, they'd fall off the map.
Oh dear.
Yeah,
That's not how the globe works after
that's
all.
right. That's right. I mean, that's living in like 1200s or around that era. But anyways, the CBC decided to feature 2 out of 3 tweets negative in its article, calling the new party embarrassing before it's even been created, and making light of the name UCP as an 8-year-old would do. And that's what the CBC journalism has been paying for this week. So one tweet was positive, 2/3 were negative, and of course they also went along with Notley's narrative that this party will be far right and will fall off the map.
And it's not even that bad of a name. I mean, it could have been worse, like the name that came about after the merger of the Reforms and the Alliance, which was the Conservative Reform Alliance Party, which, of course, the initials, you can figure that out for yourself.
Yeah, that was mentioned actually in the press conference between Brian Jean and Jason Kenney.
So clearly they're going to think very hard on the name before they even come up with it.
And what's more, it was stated that at the first AGM for this party, if the membership decides that they don't like the name United Conservative Party, they can change the name to something else. And that really underscores what the goal of the United Conservative Party is going to be. And it's going to be founded upon a framework that ensures that grassroots members, not corporate interests, not union interests, or a cabal of leaders in a dark closet, will be able to decide what the party policy is. It's going to come down to the grassroots members. And that is the founding principle of this party. And here are a few of the other guiding principles of the United Conservative Party, just to kind of contrast what Rachel Notley and the media are saying about this. And I quote from the Unity Agreement: "The rule of law, equality of all before the law, and the protection of the fundamental rights and freedoms of all. Grassroots democracy, including measures to empower Albertans to hold governments accountable during and between elections. Universal access to high-quality publicly funded health care, education as well. Environmental responsibility, including the protection and conservation of our natural environment for the benefit of future generations, and perhaps most importantly, given our current financial situation here, fiscal responsibility, including balanced budgets, debt reduction, and respect for taxpayers' money." So there's a huge number of things that stand out here. Equality and rights of freedoms at all. So this is, I mean, anybody who says his party is going to be anti-LGBTQ, well, there you go. And I think another great thing that's coming out of this founding principles is grassroots democracy and the ability to hold the government accountable between an election.
Yeah, it's something that you don't really see that often in Canada. I think BC was one of the first to come out with recall legislation back when the Social Credit Party was in the 60s and 70s, and not many other governments have done such a step to hold governments accountable for their actions between elections. And the fact that this is a founding principle of this movement is really good. And honestly, if you look at these founding principles, they don't really seem even to be that.
They don't even seem conservative. They seem pretty libertarian.
Yeah, libertarian, or I could even call it centrist, or even liberal party could come up with this sort of thing, except for perhaps the fiscal responsibility, because they love to spend money. but it just goes to show they're clearly not far right, and the fact that this is even being discussed by the mainstream media, it's really terrible, isn't it?
Yeah. And, I mean, it all comes down to being able to get these founding principles out there and inform Albertans what they are. And if you take this to Albertans, after what we've had the last 2 years and what we've had for the last decade and a half under the PCs, it's going to be a welcome refresh to democracy and government in Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, so in the press conference between Brian Jean and Jason Kenney, they said, what can you do if this idea is appealing to you? Well, the answer to that is to either buy a membership for either the Wildrose or PC party and take part in the referendum this summer and vote for a new leader in the fall. And I think the final remark I'd like to make here is that it's not going to be an easy run between now and the next election to make this work. because, there could be snags along the way, and it's a lot of work to establish a new political party. But overall, this process has been far more successful than it was initially thought it would be after the last election, or even last summer when the entire campaign first started.
Yeah, and this is probably the biggest bombshell to come out of Alberta politics since Daniel Smith and several Wildrose MPs or MLAs crossed the floor and joined the PCs. Now basically the rest of them are joining, and
there's one key difference, though. There's one key difference. It's being done by the grassroots this time.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that a lot of people were wanting to see happen.
Yeah, most definitely. And, I mean, you take these founding principles and apply them to a political party, and I think it's going to be something that's winnable. So, interesting times ahead.
Yeah.
And also interesting times ahead for you in BC, it seems.
Oh, yes, there's always interesting times in BC. For people that live in BC, politics is something that it's something that a lot of people don't like to talk about, but it's something that pervades everywhere in our society. And a lot of people go out and vote in BC, and for them, seeing such uncertainty after the last election that was held, almost 2 weeks ago, still happening is it's going to be quite baffling to a lot of people. So there's been a lot of stories that have come out over the past week about what's going to happen to BC, what's going to happen in the legislature, who's going to form government and whatnot. And basically it all boils down to that we still don't know what's going to happen. I mean, that's still going to be continuing. We won't know until May 24th what the final results of the election will be, as the absentee ballots still need to be counted, and recounts happen after that as well. So a story came out earlier that Elections BC is rejecting 4 of the requests for recounts, accepting those only for Vancouver Falls Creek, where there were actually shown to be irregularities between the counting process, and of course Courtney Comox, where the difference between the top 2 candidates was less than 100 votes. And listeners might remember last week when I talked about this, that there's only 9 votes between the winning NDP and the second-placed Liberals in that riding. So anything could happen there, especially when the absentee ballots are counted. So you might remember that the standings are still 1 seat short for a Liberal majority, barring the recounts and everything else. So the fate of BC's government still hangs in the balance. So with all this uncertainty, the Liberals, NDP, and Greens, they've started preliminary discussion with each other, with the Liberals open to working with the Greens, even if they do end up with a majority, feeling that the gap between their platforms is not too great to overcome, whereas the NDP feel that the Green platform is closer to the NDP's and are the, quote, natural choice to work with them. But so basically, the Green Party, with their 3 seats out of 87, have become kingmakers, basically, in the fact that they can really influence what's going to happen in BC government. Even if the Liberals win the recounts and gain their slim majority, they still have to have a speaker, which would mean that their majority is going to be very slim indeed. So there's not going to be much leeway. So Christy Clark has said that she wants to work with the Green Party to try and create a stable government. So what do the Greens think about this, you might ask? Well, the most worrying part, I think, of the Green influence budget that the Liberals are working towards is the Green Party's, quote, non-negotiable demand for proportional representation, with Green Party leader Weaver saying, quote, our position has been that we would bring in proportional representation without a referendum because it is one of our 6 guiding principles, and we cannot go against who we are. So for those who don't really know, proportional representation generally allocates legislature seat share among parties based on the popular vote and how many people vote for a certain party. And of course, this would greatly help the Greens and other smaller parties. The Greens, of course, got about 15% of the vote in this last election, but they only got 3 seats, which is about I guess 5% of the seats. So they would gain about 10 seats if they were under proportional representation. So it would help the Greens and other smaller parties such as the Libertarian Party, the leaderless BC Conservative Party, and also the Communist Party and the Marxist-Leninist parties of BC.
Do you guys have a Christian Heritage Party there?
I don't actually know if we have Christian Heritage, but I think we do. I know that the Christian Heritage certainly campaigns federally here, but I think there is one, but I don't think they're very big. I don't think they run too many members. So they did nominate five. As I'm looking at it, they did actually nominate 5 candidates in the last election. Of course, none of them were elected, but they are one of those smaller parties that do actually get some share of the votes.
You know, this is a can of worms, not just for the reason that you can't. It doesn't make sense to have a change of government system to proportional without a referendum. That's number one that makes it a can of worms. Number two is that given the way BC is structured, you could probably say goodbye to majority governments in BC with this going forward, and it would be a question up to the population there if they would rather have parties like the Green, the Conservatives, and whatnot having a say in matters at the stake of stable majority governments.
Yeah, and some people would generally like that, I think, probably, but a lot of people probably wouldn't. And I think that a lot of people would also not like it if it's forced on us without a referendum. Yep. Of course, with proportional representation, not only would it help the really smaller parties, but it also really impact the bigger parties, both the Liberals and the NDP. And they would both see a significant decrease of influence just by accepting this demand of the Greens. So I think the fact that the Greens are basically holding the new government to ransom over this issue without letting BC voters decide if the electoral system even needs to be changed, it's really undemocratic, and it really flies in the face of what voters wanted to begin with. They probably wanted a lot of the parties to work together, but they didn't want non-negotiable demands about certain things. And before the election, electoral reform wasn't even mentioned at all. And for it to become such a big issue after the election, it should concern us all.
I would have thought corporate and union donations would have been a bigger non-negotiable issue from the NDP or the Greens.
Well, the Greens certainly have been mentioning that quite a bit as well, and the NDP said they'd work on that issue, and the Liberals said they'd work on that issue. So Greens, of course, they're going for something that would help them out at the detriment of the other parties to see if they're really willing to work together.
You know, I think if an election were called on this issue of proportional representation versus what you guys have right now, and, you know, it was floated by the Greens, would you be surprised if the Greens lost all their seats because of this?
I don't think they would lose all of their seats. I think they might go back down to 1 again. But you see, where they won their seats on Vancouver Island, it's very much environmental and very much.
No, they probably don't care about democracy out there then, anyways.
Yeah, they wouldn't really probably care about this issue much. So the Greens are just trying to help themselves out in this case. And this whole thing about them pushing for electoral reform without a referendum, it kind of reminds me of when the Liberal government tried to force the HST on the province, which, of course, people remember this, raised taxes on pretty much everyone on
and it backfired
certain items. Yeah, and there was such a huge backlash on it that Gordon Campbell had to resign and basically run out of BC because of how unpopular it was. And the fact that the Liberals were able to win again was really surprising to a lot of people because they weren't thinking it would happen. So I think if the government tries to change the electoral system of BC without having a referendum, there will be massive consequences for everyone in the province, and politics in BC as we know it will be forever changed if that does come to pass.
Well, let's hope that, you know, it doesn't make sense to force an issue that you didn't campaign on, and you didn't, you know, consult the people with in the televised debate. So, I mean, it should just stick to what the platform is, because if not, like you said, it's being really completely undemocratic. So.
Yeah, and it's something that hadn't been talked about before this week, and the fact that they're in such a situation to be able to try and force this demand, it's really quite something. And you, in a sense, you got to kind of hand it to him because he's taking all he can. But in another sense, you got to think the voters didn't decide on this. They voted for they voted for their parties, and they wanted. You could definitely say that they wanted something to change in BC government. They wanted the Liberal government to be held to account for what they have done, but they don't want the Greens to be able to be forcing these demands because when you look at it, not that many people voted for the Greens. It was only
16%.
about 16% of the people that voted, and you have to have a referendum on this issue. I think
Absolutely.
it's just, and to me, that's something that's non-negotiable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it'd be interesting to see where the BC Liberals on this stand and what the NDP have to say. But I guess we'll have a greater picture of how valuable this demand is in 4 days once the recounts happen and the absentees are counted.
Yeah, and we'll hopefully have a better picture of where we're going to stand next week's show. So that will be definitely something to tune in then.
All right. Moving to the wider Canada picture, this headline is National Energy Board Needs Major Overhaul, panel says. So we talked about the National Energy Board before and the discussions that were going on about how it should be moved from Calgary to Ottawa. Well, we have an answer this week. The National Energy Board faces a crisis of confidence and needs to be fundamentally overhauled, including loosening its ties to Calgary. This is what a government-appointed panel concluded in a report released this past Monday. In the report released on Monday, the 5-member advisory panel concluded that the National Energy Board has fundamentally lost the confidence of many Canadians. That's some pretty grandiose language right there. When I think if you went out on the streets and you asked, oh, what do you think of the National Energy Board? I don't think many people would be able to tell you.
Yeah, they probably wouldn't say, well, they fundamentally lost the confidence of me. And they'd probably say, what is the National Energy Board and what does it do?
Exactly.
And probably someone who actually follows politics, they might say, well, they're the ones who regulate the energy industry in Canada, right? And they probably wouldn't be able to tell you much more than that, right?
Indeed. Well, the report also recommends that the NEB be completely overhauled and be renamed the Canadian Energy Transmission Commission. That's a mouthful, CETC, with appointments from a broader cross-section of society and a board of directors based in Ottawa. The main office would remain in Calgary, but board members would no longer be required to live there, and satellite offices would be established throughout the country. All right, so it sounds as though it's a shift from a Calgary center of focus to a more national center of focus, and even Premier Rachel Notley is opposed to this idea and feels that moving operations to Ottawa is quote-unquote dumb. So,
which it is.
Yes. And while it may appear that this move was suggested by a committee, the truth of the matter is that panels and committees are almost always filled by the government of the day. And that, this of course means that the views of other parties and stakeholders in general are overshadowed by the will of the government. Given the Trudeau government's push for a national carbon tax, which was actually talked about this week, that the government regulates the environment, so therefore they have the ability, in their view, to push a carbon tax on provinces who don't want one. They were mainly talking about Saskatchewan in this case, and the reluctance to greenlight new pipeline projects that have already been approved by the NEB. There's no question that this government is asserting its will over the issue of energy. And, all one needs to do is really look back at the National Energy Program at the first Trudeau government to realize that this government and that government want to ensure that the control of natural resources remains tied to Ottawa. It makes zero sense to move the NEB offices to Ottawa unless there's a true intention is to make the NEB partisan and ultimately assert more government control over the industry. The current Trudeau government is festering the feelings of Western alienation that plagued the West in the 1980s and 1990s. I think we're heading there. I don't know if we're at those levels yet, but I think we're heading there.
Yeah, I think that I think that the West is probably looking at the Liberal government and probably starting to scratch their heads a bit and ask questions, but they're not at the point of complete abandonment that
No.
they were back then.
Yeah, and history is a really important teaching tool. And this Trudeau must not take his 4 seats in Alberta for granted, 2 of which are in Calgary, which before this election hadn't gone to the Liberals since the 1960s. So there's some messaging right there that could change come next election. And also moving the NEB head office to Ottawa would make as much sense as moving the offices that control the regulation of the automobile industry to Vancouver, if that makes sense.
It does, actually. Like, there's a lot of head offices that should be in Vancouver, but the automobile industry, definitely not one of them. It definitely should be in Ontario, where all the factories and plants are.
Exactly.
just as the National Energy Board should be in Alberta, where the majority of our energy industry is located.
And that's how absurd and silly this discussion is. It's weird to see it from this side when, if it was the other way, it would just not be happening at all, that discussion. And on a somewhat related note, there are other items in the news that back up this trend of the Trudeau government consolidating powers to area of Liberal control. It was revealed this week that moving the Immigration Processing Centre from Vegreville to Edmonton will actually cost $46.6 million in renovations and leasing over the next 25 years just to move the facility to downtown Edmonton. We first discussed this back on episode 4 of The Right Side. And ultimately, maintaining the same facility in Vegreville would only cost $35.8 million. So that's roughly $10.8 million less to keep the facility in Vegreville, keep the jobs there, keep the town going, and ultimately not disrupt those 300 workers and their families. And ultimately, this story about the Vegreville Immigration Processing Center is the absolute opposite of what John McCallum told us last fall about why the move was being done. So you can see some parallels here between the carbon tax, the NEB relocation, and the relocation of this Vegreville Immigration Processing Center. It's quite clear when you look at what this government's doing.
Yeah, and if you look at it on the face of it with no blinders on, you'll see that a lot of these moves make no sense. But then if you look into what the actual motivations of the government would be on this issue, it makes a lot of sense. They're trying to put these sort of things under their control, and they're trying to have more big government in Canadian lives, and they're trying to force these moves through.
Specifically, more big government control of the western side of the country.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that they're planning on doing all these things, it really should raise a lot of eyebrows in the West.
Oh, believe me, it is. I would not be surprised if the Liberal Party loses all 4 seats in Alberta next election.
And they might lose a few in BC too.
Yep.
We'll see what happens. But speaking of completely unnecessary moves, let's head over to the firing line, which of course is our segment that we talk about something that has happened that really, really makes you scratch your head and think, why on earth are they doing this? And to that, we go to the story, which I found a bit earlier in the week, and the headline, as soon as I saw it, I thought, we've got to put this in the firing line. We should have this in the show, and this is something that is going to be very interesting to talk about. And that is the headline, Ottawa to apologize to those who suffered because of sexuality. So, basically, the background to this story is that Justin Trudeau's government will make a formal apology to the House of Commons in the fall to the Canadians who have suffered, quote, governmental discrimination based on sexuality in the past. So the apology will occur after an earlier promise in November to review hundreds of cases of those dismissed from their jobs in the government and the military, mostly before the 1970s, based on their sexual practices, shall we say, for lack of a better term. This echoes Trudeau Sr.'s strong views of the government as, quote, having no place in the bedrooms of the nation. So it's something that son is taking after father in this sort of case. So, along with the apology for the dismissals, Edmonton MP Randy Boissonneau, which is one of the Alberta Liberal MPs that we talked about just a few moments ago, he was appointed Trudeau's, quote, special advisor on LGBT issues, whatever that means, and he is working towards, quote, eliminating laws that intentionally or unintentionally discriminate against sexual minorities.
I got to stop you right there.
I think you will.
Two things. Trudeau taking after his dad is no surprise, and there's other questions that could be raised about that, but we'll save that for another special episode of The Right Side in the future. The second issue is eliminating laws that intentionally or unintentionally discriminate against sexual minorities. What are we, Saudi Arabia?
I don't know.
I wasn't aware we had any of these left on the books.
Yeah, I thought it was all pretty much covered in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that, you know, you can't be discriminated against based on these issues. So the fact that they're, you know, taking a fine-tooth comb to all of the laws, and that's what they're spending their time on.
And, you know, it's a raising of issues that don't particularly exist. And this is what Conservative leadership candidate Brad Trost has referred to as the gay agenda, because if you look at Canada as a whole, you'd see that the vast majority of people and places are really accepting. So the question is, why is money being spent and why is consultation being spent on issues like this?
Yeah, and it's quite funny because the Globe and Mail article notes that all of these other countries like Britain, Germany, and New Zealand have passed Canada in these issues, and that there's been an outcry on the inaction of the government. But I haven't really seen very much of this outcry on the inaction of the government based on this set of issues. You've seen a lot of outcry on inaction of them in other issues, but not in this one, certainly. And the article also notes that several elements will be considered this summer, including the wording of the Prime Minister's apology, the appropriate venue for the apology, whether people who are convicted should be required to apply for pardons or whether a blanket pardon is more appropriate, whether people who are dismissed are entitled to pensions, or if any financial compensation should be offered along with the apology. Now, does that all sound like something that should take an entire summer to do?
No.
I don't think so either. I mean, this story, it should come as a bit of a surprise to listeners, as, you know, we've talked about previous stories about the inaction of the Trudeau government on, say, passing bills. Last week we talked about how they've only passed 17 of them since they came to power. We've talked about the expenditures incurred in the budgets and how their spending is increasing quite a bit, how the debt is rising with every passing year of them being in power, possible trade wars with the U.S. over oil or soft lumber or hydro. And this feels like it's
it just feels as though it's a token government who is doing things to virtue signal and make Canada look good and, in essence, apologize for the last decade prior to when they weren't in power.
Yeah, and this is really what they're spending time on. I mean, something like this should not require so much effort. I think if it's necessary, you deliver the apology, then get on with other more important things like the economy, our foreign relations, and other things that require government's attention, not spending an entire summer on the wording of the Prime Minister's apology, among other things. It's another hallmark of the inefficiencies of the Trudeau government to get anything done on time properly. It's just simply ridiculous.
And as we've mentioned before,
so much time on this.
As we've mentioned before, the fact they're working on this rather than pushing through other key agenda items could ultimately mean that a significant portion of their legislative work up to date could be scrubbed when they inevitably suspend and prorogue the House, which will probably happen this winter.
Yeah, and we mentioned that on last week's episode 16 of the show, how they're not even doing very much, and this week's story comes out saying that this is what they're spending their time on. This is what they're spending our tax dollars on. I mean, I'm probably a bit more sympathetic to these past issues and say, yeah, sure, maybe it was wrong. Sure, go send an apology. I mean, Harper did lots of apologies on behalf of the Japanese and the Chinese,
First Nations,
and other minorities, First Nations. But the fact that they're spending an entire summer on this, like they're devoting an entire committee and an MP is spending significant time on this, when there's definitely lots of other problems that are happening in Edmonton. The fact that Randy Boissonneau is spending all of his time on this and that he's, quote, special advisor on LGBT issues, it's just baffling to me.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. And, you know, this, I think, is a good way of ending the show. And the idea that government needs to be held accountable. And as the United Conservative Party has, there will be ways within that party, hopefully, to hold people accountable in between elections. So I think that leads on nicely to our word of the week.
Yes, and our word of the week this week is referendum, which is a noun which can be used as referendums or referenda. So it is a general vote by the electorate on a single political question or issue that has been referred to them for direct decision. You could say this was the electoral reform in BC the past couple times, the Quebec secession cases that happened back in the 80s and 90s. You could talk about Brexit. Those were all referendums that had huge impacts on the way that politics was carried out afterwards.
And of course, this summer, the referendum within the Wildrose Party and the Progressive Conservative Party in Alberta to ratify this unity agreement.
And of course, the fact that the Green Party of BC wants to push electoral reform without a referendum and without a key aspect of the voting population. It's something that a lot of people should be aware of, and it's something that the citizenry has in their toolkit on a way to try and limit government control over things and how they can truly hold governments accountable on issues.
Indeed. All right. Well, that was a pretty energetic episode and covered lots of interesting things this week. So I think that's about it for this episode of The Right Side. If you guys want full show notes, that's at rightsidenews.ca. Or if you want to subscribe on iTunes, rightsidenews.ca/iTunes. And we're also on Facebook and Twitter at RightSideCA. We'll see you next week, everyone, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
And we will hopefully have an answer in BC, and we'll have all show notes available for that, as well as many, many other stories to be able to cover for you. So we will see you next week.